the Force crash course for the PD1 Bootcamp. This video is going to be over the trigger handler, following up on what we learned in the last video about Apex triggers. If you haven't had a chance, please check out Trailhead. It's a great resource for self-paced learning. I do provide trail mixes at the end of each section, give you guys an opportunity to have hands-on experience with what we learned about. So these slides are going to be super quick. One thing that we need to discuss before we dive into the code is understanding what an Apex trigger handler is. It's a really simple concept where you're introducing a new layer of code to your application. We've already learned about the first layer of code where everything originates, and that's the trigger. A trigger fires whenever a record is updated, inserted, deleted, so on. That is the when. When we start adding our logic to that trigger, things might get a little complicated. And that is where the trigger handler comes in. It gives us an opportunity to implement a separation of concerns and thus have a modular code base. These two together help improve readability as well. If you're not familiar with the concept of separation of concerns or a modular code base, they are concepts that we've touched on a little bit before when we learned about methods. If you remember back to why we need to implement methods and what we discussed in that video, the whole point of a method is to group together pieces of code that all had one purpose, and you segment that in its own separate method. And that inherently gives you more modularity, and it allows you to separate methods by their concerns, and thus improves readability. That's why the concept is really similar here. That's what we're doing, essentially, but with our entire code base instead. So those were all the slides. Let's go to the developer console and actually implement this instead of just relying on the PowerPoints. If you remember from the last video, what did we do? We created an account trigger on the account based on these different context variables. If it met our conditions, we executed some piece of logic, right? Simple enough. And honestly, as of right now, this trigger isn't too complicated. Less than 40 lines of code. What we're doing is pretty simple, nothing too crazy. But could you imagine how bad it could get if we wanted other things to happen within this context and this context, and we wanted to introduce new parameters here, add other functionality? This would very easily turn into one monolithic piece of code that could potentially be over 300-400 lines long. And at that point, your code becomes very hard to maintain because there's a lot going on. There is no separation of concerns. Everything is in one place. And that's why the trigger handler is a helpful pattern for us to follow to help solve this problem. So to create a handler, there's no special format for it. It's just an Apex class. So I will just name this appropriately. I'll call it the account trigger handler. You'll notice the extension is different. It goes back to the normal extension we've been used to seeing versus this one that ended with a T. So our ultimate goal is that we want to take this logic and move it over here. Simple as that, except not exactly. So we know we can't just put code inside of a class. We have to wrap it within a method. So let's backtrack a little bit. So this piece of code is within the after update context. So what I'm going to do is come over the account trigger handler, make a new public static void method, and I will call it handle after insert. And now I'll come back here and take this code, paste it here instead, and then take the name of the method and call it directly from this trigger. Now let's see if it saves. Okay, neither of the files saved, right? We have a couple problems that we still need to address. On line 11, it says method does not exist or incorrect signature from the type account trigger. So this is trying to look for a method called handle after insert within this account trigger, but it doesn't exist, right? Because this method doesn't belong to this guy. It belongs to this instead. So we need to take the name of this class and use the dot operator to let the Salesforce compiler know that the handle after insert method that we want to call belongs to this class. And since it's static, we don't actually need to instantiate it or create a new instance of the class, otherwise known as an object. We can just call that method directly. Okay, so it still doesn't let us save. The reason for that is even though we have it written out here, this file hasn't technically saved, so Salesforce didn't compile and doesn't know about this method yet. So we need to resolve the errors here first before we can actually save this file. So what are the errors that we're getting here? It says invalid loop variable type expected sObject was account. So it's not really easy to understand from that error message, unfortunately, but the problem here is that the trigger.new context doesn't belong to this handler. It belongs to this trigger. So how do I pass the values from one class or one trigger to another class? Well, we learned about in the other video, we can pass it in as a parameter of the method. So in here, the handle after insert method, I will pass in trigger.new. Still won't let me save. And then here, I'll need to accept trigger.new. But I can't call it trigger.new. I will have to actually reference it by the underlying data type, which we learned about here is just a list of accounts. So I'm just going to copy this and cheat a little bit. And just call it new accounts. And then update it here to just say new accounts instead of trigger.new. And that should work because this is a list of accounts. We want to loop through a list of accounts and do whatever that needs to be done. And now this should save. Perfect. Isn't that a lot easier to read than what we had before? So let's do the same things here. So this is going to be the before update context. So we'll need to make another method, public static void handle before update. We will also need to pass in a list of accounts. Copy that code, move it in here, copy the name of the method, paste it in there, as well as the class name with the appropriate parameters. That's not going to save until this does first. So, oops. Let's pretend we didn't see that because I don't want to talk about that. And if it ever gets stuck on you and it takes a while, you can just right click on that tab, hit cancel save. Okay, what did we mess up? I was definitely way too eager and I didn't really pay attention to what this logic was. So this wasn't actually working off of the list of accounts. This was working off the map of accounts. So instead of passing in the list of accounts, I need to pass in a map of ID to accounts. Let's call this new account map. Now I'll also need to, since we're using new map and old map, need to copy that for a second, something like that. And then I'll just steal these variable names actually. So that should compile. Perfect. And now I need to let the account trigger know about the updates we just made with this method. So instead of passing in trigger.new, which it's going to tell us is the incorrect signature because the parameters don't match up, we need to pass in trigger.oldMap and trigger.newMap. And I think it should look like that because here I'm expecting new map and then old map. So we need to keep that consistent here. New map, then old map. Perfect. And then last thing we need to do is the before insert context. So make one last method here. And we actually don't need these. This was really just for illustration purposes. But just as easy as that, we went from a trigger that had almost 40 lines of code to something with really less than 20 lines of code. So we brought down the size of this file by half, but that's not really a measurement of quality. So don't overthink that aspect too much. But what's important here is if this is my first time looking at this account trigger, say I'm a new employee, or I am moving from a project to another and I'm trying to help out with this effort and I don't know anything about this implementation, if I have familiarity with triggers, I can read this piece of code and say, okay, after update, we're going to call this method. Before update, we're going to call this method. From here, you're not limited to just keeping in this method, so you can have other methods that get called from this context as well. So if this functionality is to, what was this for? Update description. I could make another method here. I'll probably make this one private because I only want the account trigger handler to call this method. But it also needs to be static. And for this, I'm okay with leaving it void, no return type. And we'll call it populate account description. Okay, so now you might be thinking, okay, what's the point of creating now another method just to call it from this method? Are you just trying to show off? No. What I'm trying to get at here is that there could be a lot of different things that you want to do in the before update context. And if you start adding them all just to one method, you'll run into the same problem that you had here, where you had all your code, regardless of how correlated it is, all in one section instead of separating it out. So now I could, let's say I had other methods and other things that I wanted to have happen in the before update context. I could also put those in methods. So let's say populate account description. So now if I ever needed to make changes to how I'm populating the account name, I can rest assured that I can go directly to that method and make changes there, and I won't have an impact on this method, and that method. And similarly, if someone wants to find out how we're updating the account name, it makes it really easy for them. They can come over to the account trigger, see that we call a handle before update method. They know that it belongs to this class, so they'll come in, look at the method, and say, oh, look, there's a method called populate account name. Let me go check out that one. And that's where they'll see how we're actually populating the account name. Calling this out here, I did pass in a list of whatever I wanted to work on. In this case, it's an account because the trigger's on account, but it's really important that you don't call these methods individually because more than likely at one point you're going to have DML statements in here. You might have SOQL queries in here. So it's important to handle everything in bulk, which basically means use lists instead of individual records, and have your methods accept lists instead of individual records. That is it for this video. Try to keep this one a little shorter. Unfortunately, I don't have a trail mix to provide for this section because they don't have one, just for trigger handlers. But if you can, go into your own sandbox and try to replicate the code that I wrote here and try to build some additional functionality as well for yourself. And I'll be back with another video where we'll talk about exception handling and other parts of the process and automation section of this certification exam.